welcome all of you to a conversation between Marjorie Scher, a longtime Forest Hills resident who has spearheaded the effort for our community to demand better from DC Water in the rehabilitation of our sewer system using cured-in-place pipe technology. And also welcome Andrew Whelton, who is a nationally recognized expert on CIPP technology, thermal, hot water and steam, and UV ultraviolet. In fact, he has worked with a coalition of states, including Virginia, to improve their guidelines and regulations to control and mitigate the impact of this technology on the environment. This is something DC could do as well, but has not done so far. Just to provide a larger context, DC needs to rehabilitate sewer pipes in many areas of the city, including other park areas. So this is not only a neighborhood issue, this is a citywide issue. And you can also, and it goes nationwide. To provide some history, the Forest Hills Connection has been covering this project since 2013, assisted by reportage by Marjorie Scher and David Bardeen. The National Park Service owns much of the land that Soapstone Stream runs through, from Connecticut Avenue to Broad Branch Road. The sewer pipe is embedded in the stream with manholes on either side. National Park Service was responsible for conducting an environmental assessment, with the outcome being a FONSI, which is a finding of no significant impact. National Park Service ceded that responsibility to DC Water, which hired the consultants Hazen and Sawyer. The EA and FONSI process went from 2019 to 2020. During this very public process, the community expressed major concerns over CIPP technology, especially thermal, since DC Water was leaning in this direction, but those concerns were ignored. In the summer public meeting this past year, DC Water stated that the beginning of construction was to start this spring and that they would be using steam technology. In December, ANC3F passed another resolution requesting that DC Water address the concerns of the community. It requested that DC Water stop the project until an analysis of the CIPP technologies, impact and mitigations needed be completed and presented to the community. Councilmember Che backed this request with a strong letter to DC Water, Director of DOEE Tommy Wells, and Deputy Mayor Linda Baber. So where are we today? DC Water is to mark trees to come down through February. They have switched from steam CIPP to hot water that will not require air pollution permitting from DOEE. And it is, and a supposedly less toxic liner used to line the pipes will not be made of styrene. Although styrene is not the only pollutant emitted by this process. Many questions are still left unanswered. It is still unclear whether these changes are adequate to safeguard the residents in homes and many apartment buildings that line Soapstone. This conversation will explore the differences among these technologies and the mitigations needed. Hopefully, DC Water and DOEE will be listening as well. And thank you, Marjorie and Professor Whelton. Please take it away.
Marlene, wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you. I just want to say a few more things about Professor Whelton. we've not actually seen one another except a few video snips along the way, but Valentine's Day, I just want to thank you from my heart and the hearts of the community for all your fantastic work with us and also around the country. You are an amazing source of information and knowledge and reality. And as we've been dealing with DC Water on this, there really hasn't been much reality. And just thank you so much for being here. I also want to mention that Professor Whelton has a PhD in civil engineering, an MS in environmental engineering, and a BS degree in civil engineering from nearby Virginia Tech. One beautiful thing about his work is that his skill set is to uncover and address the intersection of materials, infrastructure, environment, and public health, which is absolutely so important. So it's the application of the science and then actually going out and trying to help communities. He just returned from Colorado, where he and students putting forth their own money to begin with. We're dealing with the impacts of water on the Marshall Fire in Colorado. Before that, he was in Hawaii dealing with helping the Navy with the petroleum tank issue. So, Professor Whelton, thank you so much for being here. Are you unmuted?
I am. Thank you for having me.
Good. Okay. So as Marlene mentioned, up until a month ago, DC Water had come to a public meeting and talked about the virtues of styrene. And until a month ago, they were going to use steam, CIPP, and styrene liners. So now, as Marlene said, they say they're going to use hot water. They're going to use non-styrene liners, a non-volatile curing resin liner, and they're going to work from downstream up, and everything will go to Blue Plains, which is their wastewater treatment center. Are we better off now? Should we feel safe now?
So, thanks for having me. I get calls a lot from individuals, either after exposures, after fish kills, or by consulting engineers and even CIPP workers who called me offline asking about chemical safety. I think one of the issues that your community has identified is that there's just a tremendous amount of misinformation floating around, and it's really difficult to get your head around if you're not deep in the weeds on these things. So you can parse out, okay, that's not true, or that is true, but that's half true, and they meant to say this. So I think, one of the good things that's come out of what you all have done in the conversation that DC Water now is engaged in, as well as the regulators and such, is what exactly is known and unknown about the technologies that are targeted for use. So communities can make decisions about what is in the best interest of the public.
And thank you for that. It is an effort because one wants to trust DC Water, and even the agencies now, the Department of Energy and Environment, the National Park Service, everyone turns to DC Water, and especially to Will Elledge, the engineer, to tell them the truth, to give them information and knowledge. So the community no longer feels that we want to trust DC Water, but we can no longer trust DC Water because they were going to use the steam method and then came back to us with no information, with no documentation, with no qualification, nothing, and just said, okay, we're going to switch. It came to us on a holiday weekend on a Friday afternoon, we're going to switch, and they didn't even say what they're going to switch to. So are we better off now with them using hot water rather than steam?
So That question comes up a lot, or some people say, is UV cleaner? So there's just a number of different nuances associated with those claims that are put forward. First off, I think CIPP can likely be used without harming human health or the environment if controls were implemented. Nationwide, it is in industry's best interest to keep moving at the same procedure to discharge waste unaccounted for. Many of these include hazardous air pollutants that are in fact regulated under the Clean Air Act, including those for styrene and non-styrene or no VOC resins. So I think it's important, as you brought up, that DOE is involved and engaged because they are ultimately responsible for anything that occurs in the community, whether it be environmental pollution caused by use of any technology or the injuries associated with any open release of waste into the air or up people's sewer laterals and stuff. So I think it's very important that we recognize that DOE has an important role here, and your community should be able to rely on them to kind of help make certain that technologies are not used that jeopardize public health and the environment.
And I understand when I spoke to you the other day, you casually mentioned that you had spoken to the head of the air quality division at DOE, that between classes you picked up your cell phone and you just called him. Can you tell us about that conversation?
Certainly. So many of the pollutants, or they're not pollutants, they're chemicals that are used in resin manufacture, or they actually are brought on site, dissolved in the resins, or they're actually created when you heat the plastic or UV expose the plastic, the resin. They are generated, those are hazardous air pollutants. So this is like benzene, acetophenone, styrene, epichlorohydrin, for non-styrene, non-VOC resins. And these are regulated out of the 188 hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. So the discharge of those into the air is regulated. You can't just drive around and blow waste into the air just because you want to. There are regulations. And so DOE's attention to the fact that there are, in fact, regulated pollutants is important. And I called DOE to kind of reaffirm that, you know, this is one of the agencies that I've seen take the right step forward in terms of protecting public health, and start paying attention to the fact that, you know, these plastic manufacturing sites that are conducted outdoors can release tens to thousands of tons of hazardous air pollutants into the air, depending upon the amount of resin that's used on site and the type of practice that's used on site as well.
And you've told me before that you can calculate the amount of toxins coming off of a project when you know the amount of resin going in. So if you ask the contractor, how much resin are you bringing in, you will be able to calculate. Is that correct?
You can estimate. Unfortunately, it probably is in the interest of industry not to do that calculation, because those numbers then would be used to further enforce Clean Air Act compliance. But, you know, we've taken the CIPP resins in the laboratory and heated them up and found, you know, a certain amount of them is basically discharged into the air. It evaporates into the air. So if you start off with 100%, or let's say 100 pounds of resin, 3.35 pounds of it may, actually, I have to check the numbers on that, but I think, I forget the number exactly, but I think 3.3% is left inside the plastic. So it's residual that is unreacted. So you got about 3 pounds of it stuck inside the new plastic, or 3% of it. And then I think it's like 10 or 20% of the resin is blown into the air. And so the reason why that's important is because that just gives you submagnitude. Generally on big CIPP projects, you're not dealing with 100 pounds of resin. You're dealing with thousands of pounds of resin, tens of thousands of pounds of resin, especially down in Texas where they were doing, I think, 72-inch diameter CIPPs. So you should be able to kind of estimate that, but nobody in the field has done the total magnitude assessment because I think we're the only group out there trying to like figure out what the actual data are so that people can use that information to make public health and environmental decisions.
Thank you. So I think it's important to remember that when DC there was about a 2-day period where the National Park Service said, we're going to issue our permit, because I wrote to the acting superintendent, and she wrote back and she said, we are going to issue our permit to DC Water, but if they use steam, we're going to require an air permit. They are going to require an air permit. DOEE is. So then a few days later, DC Water announced that they are going to use hot water and therefore would not need a permit. So it's how do we get them, DOEE, to understand the science here, because the information is not coming from DC Water and it's not coming from anywhere unless the EPA steps in, correct?
Correct. So the EPA has ultimate authority over the Clean Air Act, executing the Clean Air Act, and they give primacy, meaning the authority to act on their behalf, to DOEE. The steam is one method, hot water is another method. So steam, you're looking at about 250 degrees Celsius, you're heating or cooking the plastic. Hot water, you're looking at about 200 degrees Celsius. The whole intent of that is to heat up the resin to facilitate chemical reactions of polymerization. During that heating, you have VOCs, volatile light chemicals, go into the air, and they leave the work site and go up sewer laterals or out manholes or out the exits of culverts. New York State DOT in 2001 conducted a study and documented that there are, in fact, chemical air emissions from hot water CIPP. So, you know, the Clean Air Act doesn't say if you use steam or hot water, you're okay. The Clean Air Act is pretty specific in that it is 188 air pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, and it says that under certain conditions, these are the ones we care about. So regardless of whether you're using steam or hot water or UV, you have to care about, you know, the air pollution that's being generated and whether or not it poses a health risk or an environmental risk.
So in your view, does using hot water CIPP require an air permit? Should it require an air permit?
Well, I think that would be more likely to avoid an air permit potentially if you basically contain all the emissions. See, that's one of the issues with this outdoor plastic cooking technology. You cook plastic outdoors and you just allow the emissions to go wherever they go. You blow them into the air, they go up sewer laterals, they go to kilometers away on the ground surface. That happened in Canada. I mean, there is no standard of care for capturing the waste that is generated. And I think that is the underlying issue here. So as a Clean Air Act administrator or an agency that is executing the Clean Air Act, I think that is what I would focus on. Is there a way to basically contain the waste during the plastic manufacturing? I liken this to, and I think I brought this up to you before, if I have a 2,000, or let's say 1,000-gallon diesel truck pull up next to my property, and it just dumps out the diesel onto their private property, and then the vapors come into my house, right? Well, there needs to be some sort of law or regulation to prevent that from happening. Like they have a duty not to allow their waste to basically move off their property and then into my space. And so I think that is the issue at hand: the public health and the environmental risks associated with, indiscriminate waste discharge.
Right. I want to read very briefly a question that I had drafted to the Department of Energy and Environment, because somebody there on on a Zoom call said to me, what is your concern about the soapstone project? So I wrote her a few sentence summary and then 5 questions. So my question was, how will the CIP sewer emissions be prevented from entering lateral pipes going into apartment buildings, homes, and businesses? This was the answer from DC Water. And but I should preface that by saying that I wrote this to DOEE. The following day, I received an email from Emmanuel Briggs at DC Water, who's the outreach person, and said, DOEE, and we will be putting together our heads and answering you in the next week. So a few weeks later, I received this response. IPR, who is the contractor, will provide door hangers with the following information to all laterals tied to the sewer ahead of any install. This information listed will state, and then they quote what it will state in probably 2-point type. Then they say, if the odor becomes overwhelming in your home, please call, and they give a number. The number is to the contractor, and a crew member will respond to evaluate the issue. I sent that to Professor Whelton, and your response was, this is ridiculous. So it was at that point, and so I'd like you to elaborate, please, but it was at that point which really put me over the edge and said, we are not getting good information. We are not getting science. They're trying to put one over on us and we have to do something about it. So how do you respond to what they wrote, please?
So first and foremost, the warning that we're going to potentially expose you in your home is completely unacceptable and is in complete violation of the Clean Air Act. And so the Clean Air Act, and I've written this down, explicitly states it's designed to protect public health and public welfare and to regulate emissions of hazardous air pollutants. 42 US Code 85, air pollution control. Okay, so companies cannot just drive around and pump waste into your building and say, look, you know, just give us a call, we'll help you out here. Okay, so I still think that's completely unacceptable, and that is endemic of the entire practice right now with CIPP. But let me get to the point where how do these chemicals get indoors, or where do they go? So first of all, the technology is really innovative, because what we have here is we have a PVC pipe on the outside, and I don't know if you can see it, but you can see that liner right there. So that
Yes.
plastic, it's like a new plastic pipe inside an existing, let's say, damaged PVC pipe. And so what they do is they bring that uncured resin in, soaked in, and they drag it in the pipe, and then they heat it up and cook it. And what happens is that heating for steam and hot water, the chemicals, and here's just an example of that liner. So it's kind of like felt. It's kind of like your t-shirt. And this is for hot water and steam. But you'll see on the other side is there's kind of like a shiny material. And that is sometimes a polypropylene or polyethylene or PVC like film. And sometimes what happens is, and we discovered this back in 2017, contractors told you that, well, the emissions never come indoors because we have this like really thin film that stops all the chemicals from getting inside the pipe, outside the pipe, and into the lateral. Well, it turns out a lot of these materials, because you heated them up so hot, they melted into the CIPP. And so there actually is no barrier between the uncured resin and the lateral that goes up into the building. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that if the chemicals leave the work site and enter private property, that is a whole different situation. That goes back to the diesel truck or the diesel spill next to your house. So is it your fault that the diesel truck emissions, you know, spilled and went into your house? No, it is not, because the contaminants should have not entered private property, should not enter public property. There's a standard of care needed to protect public health and welfare and contain the emissions from manufacturing sites. And that is why I have expressed serious reservations around the country when this process is used, and contractors endorsed by municipalities and utilities allow for these things to happen.
Thank you. Which makes me think about the process that we thought was in place, a democratic process where there was because of NEPA, there was an environmental assessment. It was shifted to DC Water. Then the environmental assessment did not talk about pollution, toxins, or anything. It was an environmental assessment without the environment. It did not talk about pollution, did not talk about toxins, just avoided all that. It didn't discern, discriminate, even mention that there were different kinds of CIPP. It didn't mention UV, ultraviolet. It only mentioned thermal. So then we were, the way I found you was my immediate concern was all the 500, 600 trees that were going to be cut down in the national park. Why wasn't the national park concerned, or the Rock Creek Conservancy? Why weren't they concerned about all the trees coming down? Trees have an environmental impact. We all know that. Why weren't the trees mentioned? So it was through trying to find a smaller footprint that I started learning about the health risks and the environmental impact of the process. Can you tell us what we're going to be looking at, what the site will be look like? They're going to take down the trees to cut wide paths for their refrigerator trucks, for their boiler trucks. It's not to do the work, but it's to reach the manholes and to reach this area. Will these be diesel trucks? Will these be very wide trucks? And will they be running for 5-6 hours to heat up the water to then cure the pipe? What's this going to look like?
So whether you do CIPP or open trench excavation and dig up, knock down trees and dig up, soil and earth to remove and replace pipes, you're going to have construction activity for sure. With regards to CIPP, you will have, or depending on the process, you will have potentially boiler trucks come in, resin trucks drive in, boiler trucks come in, and kind of snake the uncured resin tube into these pipes, manhole to manhole. You'll have them out there for hours likely at a time, trying to heat up and cook the plastic. You'll also have, of course, as you'd mentioned, pollutant emissions from those vehicles. But you'll also likely have, if you're using steam anything, non-styrene or styrene or no VOC or yes VOC, you're going to have air pollutant emissions there. And historically, what happens is contractors hook up these EPDM black plastics to the end of the pipe in the manhole, and then they set up like a tripod and an exhaust stack, and they blow the exhaust directly into the air. In the past, we found out that exhaust is not steam. So that's often what people were told until 2017, when we discovered it certainly isn't steam. It's a multi-phase chemical mixture of actually like uncured resin that's been scoured out of the tube. It's VOCs and volatile organic compounds and SVOCs, semi-volatile organic compounds, and even like very, very small pieces of plastic that are inhalable that we found actually on trees near where the projects were conducted. So it is primarily problematic because of the failure to contain waste and discharge it directly into the environment untreated and unmeasured. So I think that's really where the impacts will be, because you'll have excavation and all sorts of other trucks moving earth if you do open trench excavation, but the acute, pollutant impact would be associated more with CIPP, and the hazards associated with that are not associated with, open trench excavation, for example.
And can the contractors be trusted? I understand that they shoulder the liability, that DC Water will pretty much disappear and it will be the contractors for the next couple of years. And how long is their warranty for? What are they? What can we expect?
So one of the issues that I still run across today is there are many really good contractors that want to do the right thing, that are making a living on something that they're trained about doing. Unfortunately, many of them are listening to, an echo chamber and being fed information that jeopardizes their own workers. And so if, for example, a contractor comes to you and says that it's non-toxic, that the smell is not a health risk, they might actually believe that even though it's not true. And so compassion for the contractors is something I have, since many call me individually asking about issues. The other thing is, as far as, will the utility be responsible for whatever happens? I would say, well, first and foremost, the Clean Air Act Primacy Agency is responsible for what happens. And in soapstone situation, actually the National Park Service, if they have issued the permit, have basically putting themselves on the hook for any and all consequences associated with environmental impacts and injuries, personal injuries, because the technologies that are evaluated and planned to be used have known human health and environmental impacts. And so if the FONSI or whatnot did not consider that, then that's a failure to appropriately execute requirements, I believe, under the National Environmental Policy Act. So there's going that way. There are some responsibility there, but the pipes can be repaired, and certainly done so in a safe and effective manner. It just requires people, living up to the responsibilities of the Clean Water Act and protecting public health, welfare, and safety above all.
That's reassuring. How do we gain confidence in what's going to happen when a month ago they were going to use steam and styrene liners, and now say they're using non-styrene liners? How can
I'm sorry.
How can we trust them?
Well, I say you can use steam CIPP that with styrene if you were to capture the waste. So the issue is the waste. It's not actually the material itself, or right now it's the waste. If you captured that waste, all the waste from steam CIPP, or destroyed it or treated it, if you did that, you would basically remove the biggest environmental and human health issue associated with technology as we know it today. So I think that's important to realize. I do not know why a utility would change the approach so rapidly. But sometimes utilities just listen to industry without actually providing critical thinking associated with what exactly a technology has for risks and how to mitigate those risks using the same technology without changing technology.
Yeah. Well, that brings up the point about UV, because what DC Water told me, and this was 2 months ago on a call with Marlene Berlin and me, after the article came out in the Forest Hills Connection, we asked, why aren't you using UV? Can you give us reasons? And Will Elledge hesitated, and then the next day wrote and he said, I really apologize. I know very little about UV. You probably picked up my reservation, and I'm now starting to research it. This was 2 months ago. And some people think it's wonderful because it has the following qualities, and other people still have reservations about it. I'm wondering why in Europe Europe has about 90% of Europe, I understand, uses UV. Why not in the United States? In the United States, it's about 10%. From what I know as a layperson looking into this, that Stratview says that it's the liner that's going to become the most popular because so many people have environmental concerns. It is stronger and it's much quicker to install. So why do you think it's being used so much in Europe and not in the US?
I don't know. I do know in Europe, for example, they have a better handle on chemicals leaching from plastic drinking water pipes. They actually know a heck of a lot more than we do in the US. And this might be one of the infrastructure reasons why they're using UV and not as much steam or hot water. I would say, UV is different from steam and hot water CIPP because in UV, they actually put like a fiberglass mat in the resin. So that fiberglass gives it strength. And so you don't have to have like something this thick. So this is 2 pieces of felt cured on top of each other. This is a thermally cured CIPP. And a UV CIPP would be only a fraction of the thickness, which means that it's only a fraction of the amount of resin you bring on site. So there's that difference there. And another difference is that during UV curing, you're not generally trying to get the resin to 250 degrees or 200 degrees for hours. You're basically just dragging a UV light train down the tube, and it is causing chemical reactions where the polymer is transforming into a plastic, but you're not generating the amount of emissions like you are with hot water or steam. So there's very different pollution magnitudes associated with these different technologies. What I typically do, though, is defer to the civil engineers who say whether or not a certain technology can be or should be used and should not be used based on their ability to get it around bends or other defects associated with the pipes they're dealing with. But ultimately, as I've told you before, pollution, environmental health, and human safety should drive everything. And from there, you select technologies. You don't select technologies and say, okay, well, how do we use this technology that does this type of pollution and this type of human health harm because we really want to use it because it's cheap. You want to basically determine what your thresholds are for human health and environmental protection, and then say, well, these 2 technologies or this one doesn't fit that. These 2 do if we make modifications for protect human health and the environment. So that's how I would approach things.
Yes. And what the community wanted and what was required by the EA was some specificity about the 3 different methods of CIPP. So that we would know, we would have information, we would have science about each one, and that's never happened. And still now we've asked for it. So I think actually it would be quite useful because then maybe DC Water would actually learn about the various methods. So it was left up to, in the EA, it was left up to the contractor to decide what kind of method of CIPP. It wasn't specified, but it was left up to the contractor. But DC Water hired only a thermal CIP contractor. So when they were going to go in and do steam and now switch to hot water, they probably switched because they had a contract, I'm assuming, and they wanted to keep that contractor. And there was public pushback about the steam, so they switched to hot water. But again, with no information and no specificity, it was just handed to us. Who should make sure the contractor captures the waste? How can that be done? What should we do?
Well, I would say, so the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is the executive agent for the Clean Air Act. And the any air emissions from these plastic manufacturing sites would fall under, Clean Air Act requirements. The boat manufacturing industry, the fiberglass manufacturing industry, where they make composites, they actually, like, if you cook plastics in a building and you sell widgets on the market, you actually have to comply with Clean Air Act requirements. So the Clean Air Act has direct relevance to CIPP manufacturers. And that would be, I believe, the responsibility of DOEE. With regards to water or liquid wastes, if, for example, hot water CIPP is used, you're going to generate hundreds to thousands of gallons of chemical laden water. This water doesn't have a few ppm of styrene and such in it. Years ago, you saw a lot of industry literature claiming that it was harmless. I mean, industry even openly recommended that people dump that waste into streams and ditches. And that's in violation of the Clean Water Act. You can't manufacture widgets or products and then dump your waste wherever you want just because it's convenient. So Clean Water Act requirements would fall under any discharge of water into waterways and regulated water bodies and such. The waste could be taken to a publicly owned treatment works, I believe like Blue Plains, and Blue Plains would then be responsible for any and all damages associated with accepting that waste. So this has happened elsewhere, in California, in Canada, where hot water CIPP was used, and they basically just cut the end of the newly created plastic and let all that water rush down to a wastewater plant, and it negatively impacted that wastewater plant. So as engineers that run and operate, wastewater treatment facilities, they would want to know what exactly is in that wastewater that they're accepting, because they are legally responsible for any and all consequences at their treatment plant. And two, if that waste basically moves down the sewer system, I was taught in a CIPP construction inspector class that the vapors will go up sewer laterals on the way down to the wastewater treatment plant. And so people, thousands of feet, miles away may actually become chemically exposed if those chemicals were to go up the sewer laterals. So there's a number of people and agencies that are responsible for overseeing these types of activities. And I'm heartened to see that in DC, DOEE has taken a proactive public health and environmental position so that these sewer lines can be repaired, but done so in a responsible way.
But since DC Water has switched, they've dropped out. They say they're not going to, as far as we know, they say they're not going to require any air permits. And when Council Member Che had an oversight hearing a few weeks ago, Director Tommy Wells, who heads up DOEE, she asked him excellent questions and said that there was a lot of concern, and she wanted reporting from him of what they were looking at, what information they had, what they were, how they were going to base their decision. As far as I know, she hasn't received anything. Another piece of this is, it's very curious that Director Tommy Wells is also chairman of the board of DC Water. And I've listened to the hearings, and I have not heard any interrogation about any environmental impact at all, CIPP. And their environmental quality committee is meeting next week, and apparently they're taking it up because they've gotten wind that there's issues of concern. But DOEE is not involved, at least at this point.
So based on my discussions Friday, I think it was Friday or later last week, it was my understanding DOE has not made a decision because they were being sent new information and they needed to get up to speed to make sure that their decision was based on science and understanding before they made a decision. So that is my understanding of it. And one of the reasons why I think you all are being well served by DOE and the engineers and scientists there and the leadership, because they were taking a deliberative decision about all these new developments associated with different technologies being used as proposed as options. I would say I would be interested in whether or not, when these decisions are made, information is being provided by the utility to the regulator to show exactly what's going on, because just saying you're going to do one thing and not the other puts the onus on the Clean Air Act primacy agency to basically figure out what maybe the utility doesn't know, which I don't think is protecting public health or in the best interest of public health. There should be full disclosure about the materials, chemicals associated with it, as DC Water, in my view, would not want any harm to occur to its population or the environment.
Thank you.
Sherry, let me just interrupt for a moment, because there's a public meeting coming up with DC Water, and Professor Whelton, if you could, what should we be requesting of DC Water in that meeting in order for them to go forward in a safe manner? What should we be hearing from them as far as mitigation of any of the pollution that would happen?
So I would say, first and foremost, it is the Clean Air Act primacy agency's responsibility to protect public health and the environment. And the actions that you all have taken have facilitated that awareness, which is good. The Clean Air Act primacy agency should be asking for evidence for and against these certain actions. And that is their responsibility. They do it for industrial manufacturing facilities that are located on Main Street that have stacks coming out. They do it for agricultural operations. They do it for all sorts of different operations. So it is their responsibility to do something about, whether or not permitting is required, and then what conditions are needed for each type of scenario. As far as, what you could ask DC Water or really any utility across the country, often what happens is CIPP is used and people don't know. And you don't really find out until maybe there's injuries, or you find some type of a doorknob hanger, and you find out that maybe there's an odor in your house that you don't understand, or there's a fish kill like we saw in Pennsylvania, where a criminal investigation was opened up against a CIPP contractor because they discharged their waste into one of the top 10 trout streams. So I think awareness is important. Being involved is important in the discussions. And another issue that we typically find, and I don't really know how to address this, is that some utilities simply just take what the industry's given them and just push it forward to their people without any critical thinking along the way. Whereas, do I really want to send this? Does this make sense? And unfortunately for CIPP, that's been done for like 30 years. So it wasn't until 2017 that utilities across the country started having to come to terms with the fact that there have been actual real injuries, environmental damage with the technology, and it was all preventable. But because the engineers and scientists didn't actually put forward a good faith effort to do so, these types of harms occurred. So I would, not having direct experience with DC Water recently, I would say that, I would give them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they're just trying to find the right process to use, but they don't necessarily have the understanding about what the consequences are with each process. And there again, I think it's their DOE or the Clean Air Act primacy agency's responsibility to step in to say, look, we don't care what process you use as long as you don't cause harm to human health and the environment. And if you choose this process, you should use this type of pollution monitoring, control, and permitting process. If you choose this one, you should use this process. And so I think it's really important that DOEE, assert their authority to protect public health and the environment, especially since it's in a national park, which is, even more significant than just on Main Street.
Yeah, a national park that's lined with a school, apartment buildings, homes, businesses. And you've documented on your website, your CIPP safety website, hundreds, 150 or so incidents around the country. And Robin Lloyd has done a tremendous job. She's on the call. She's done a tremendous job documenting incidents and really going into the human aspect of them, that it's not just 150 people who died or 65 children who went to the hospital in Wisconsin recently. Her journalism is not the numbers, it's the human beings and the lives. The CIPP worker, Brett Morrow, who didn't need to die, but got enveloped by the styrene. And then the recent report that NASCO put out. These are human lives. And so I wonder when we've asked DC Water, in giving them the benefit of the doubt and thinking, well, they really do have the information, please have a third-party advisor, someone who has no financial interest, but somebody third party to advise you. They said, well, we're going to go to Louisiana State, and then to University of Texas at Arlington. Could you talk about that a little bit, and NASCO and your experience? Because I think it's very revealing.
So it's my understanding. So when I got involved in CIPP maybe over 9 years ago, it was made clear to me that there were several utilities that helped get CIPP off the ground. And in one of those, Los Angeles was one. I think Indianapolis was another, and I believe DC Water's name came up too. And so for the last 30 years or so, there's a group out there that is basically the trade association for CIPP, primarily 80% hot water and steam CIPP. And so that's where the greatest growth has happened. And so I would say that trade association likes to fund people that have nice things to say about the technology and have helped them move that technology into practice and widespread use. There are people at University of Texas Arlington that have done studies. Some of those are problematic in that one of them, for example, shows that as you decrease the amount of resin you bring on site, you increase the amount of resin you bring on site, you decrease the environmental impact. And so that was a study that just came out, a couple of years ago, which doesn't make any sense. But there's some issues there, whereas you don't necessarily see, the truth behind things. And that is that there have been, as you mentioned, hundreds of exposure cases and incidents. One of the reasons why Federal Highway Administration funded us to help 6 departments of transportation across the country. They want to use CIPP safely. They want to use it, complete the project, and move on. They don't want a fish kill. They don't want people complaining about injuries. And so, you need to basically look to see where the information is coming from and who's funded it, what type of transparency is being provided. And that is really important in this whole, discussion. If utilities are just parroting talking points from industries that have their own financial interests at stake, that tells you something. Sometimes people do it not knowing that what they're saying isn't true or slanted, but other times they do know. And I know that because I've talked to several people at different organizations across the country. It's well known that CIPP can be used safely if appropriate controls were implemented. But that requires Clean Air Act oversight, Clean Water Act oversight, as well as, not willy-nilly discharging the waste into the environment without concern for the consequences of it. So there's ways that you can do it safely. I have not yet seen it adopted that way because no agencies or communities have actually stood up and said they want it done safely.
We're saying that it's a matter of us being heard. In terms of, I have one short question before, and I know we're getting very close to the 1 o'clock hour, and you need to go back to your teaching. Would you had told me about a company called Electroscan, and what we know is that CCTV has gone and looked at the sewers and said, 6,200 linear feet of sewers need to be rehabilitated. It occurred to me with this new system that catches things, they come in after the work has been done, and they often pick up errors or places where it hasn't been done properly, or they do the survey work, the surveillance beforehand, and they pick up things that CCTV hasn't picked up. They told me when I called them last week that it happens very often where work is done, but it doesn't need to be done necessarily. There's a grant and so they do it. Or the sewers are old. They need to be repaired. I wonder if it's possible to go in and do a survey and then set priorities that only sections need to be worked on, or we work on one section, or you divide up the park and you look at it and say, okay, well, we can do UV here because we could leave 100 more trees if we do UV and it's going to work. So those are the options that run through my mind. I wonder if DC Water should treat UV, if you think that DC Water should treat UV as a serious option. I know they regret that they didn't listen 3 years ago when we raised it with them. They have said that.
Well, I would say for steam applications, I've seen real problems with steam in that, when you cook the liners with steam, you can actually create little tubes that go through the pipe wall. And it's just a direct path. It's a little pipe through your tube, and if you have water on the outside, it comes in. So those are called pinholes. You can have blistering where you heat it up too hot. Each of the CIPP manufacturing processes has its own advantages and disadvantages. For the purposes of human health and the environment, as I mentioned before, it comes down to the waste. It comes down to the acute waste that's generated on site, as well as the longer term, leaching of it. UV has its own advantages and disadvantages. It uses less resin. It has actually a PVC liner on the outside of it. So instead of, for example, this is a thermal CIPP, right, where you have the two felts. You can see the two felts there. For UV, they would have like a PVC piece of material on the outside that basically prevents the volatiles from trying to go through it and come out into the environment. So there are advantages and disadvantages of this. UV is not used much in the United States, primarily because it's expensive. But ultimately, expense is determined by what you do with the waste. And so if you're discharging the waste into streams and ditches and blowing it into the air, yeah, it's going to be cheaper. But if you actually responsibly collected it or treated it or destroyed it, now you could probably get on more equal footing with the other technologies that are available that do seem to have less pollution associated with them.
DC Water promised us that steam was safe as well. Can you just talk a little bit more about the two studies from New York City that used hot water?
Sure. So if anybody tells you that steam CIPP is safe or UV CIPP is safe, or hot water CIPP state, just stop them. Because, it's nice to say these platitudes that things are safe, things are, comfortable. But, cigarettes were safe too. So the fact of the matter is, like, if somebody's just going along and saying things are, absolutely safe, or, there's a problem there. The processes can be used in a way that doesn't jeopardize human health and environment through the recommendations that I mentioned previously. So the technology certainly can be used, and I would say not excluding any of technologies, but the waste and the pollutant emissions have to be dealt with appropriately. With regards to New York State, had some issues, environmental issues, and that's one of the reasons why they jumped on this multi-state federal highway project. They had some issues where they might have had contamination and a fish kill, and they wanted to make sure that this never happened again. So what they did was they conducted their own study where they had hot water CIPP being cooked in a stormwater culvert, like on the side of the road, and they saw this white stuff coming out of it. Now, you may hear from people all the time that hot water CIPP doesn't have any emissions. That's not true. So it does, but the type and scale of those emissions are actually less understood than the emissions that are leaving steam CIPP sites and UV CIPP sites. So there are emissions that happen from these materials, but unfortunately, the testing needed to better characterize them and understand, what exactly they are and when are they the greatest versus when are they not, has been poorly documented. And that's one of the efforts that we've been working on, is trying to get the data out there so the public and stakeholders can better understand materials that are being used, what types of pollutants are being generated, so we can protect not only workers, but the public and the environment in the surrounding area.
Did I hear you correctly when you said, though, that you've never seen it be done correctly, the CIP process? You haven't seen it done correctly? Where
Yes.
the waste is captured?
Yeah, I've not. And that's because the industry for 30 plus years has openly cooked plastic outside without any air pollution controls. And so it's not surprising that that air pollution ends up getting someplace and affecting other people or the environment. Some contractors dump their waste into streams and ditches. In Colorado, a hot water CIPP job ended up contaminating a ski resort's drinking water system, which isn't a good thing in Colorado because they like skiing. So the governor's office opened an investigation. And so one of the issues here is that the industry, many of these really well-meaning contractors and company presidents of these CIPP companies just didn't know. Like, nobody taught them about how to safely use these materials. They were just taught how to cook plastic, and then they jumped into actually doing it. And so since 2017, we've been really pushing this education effort for workers. And NIOSH has been doing that too, so that people understand, safe and unsafe practices associated with CIPP. From the public side of things, Clean Air Act administrators, Clean Water Act administrators, they've kind of been on the dark too, because the industry has historically kept under the radar, and they're kind of removed from these administrators, right? So the utility and municipality is the one that chooses them. Then they get something happening. They don't notify the health department. They don't notify the people that may be called in to investigate a bad situation. And then everything might be fine. They move on, or something goes wrong, and then everybody shows up and says, well, what is this? Who approved this? Why didn't we do this and that, the other? So there's really been a disjointed approach from a policy public health protection angle that needs to be addressed. And that's what I think, and I'm heartened to see DOEE paying particular attention to it.
I hope that's true. I hope that's
Okay, Marge, yeah, let me just,
Marlene, do you have anything? else to add?
No, I just think we need to, the only thing is I see some hands up. We are not taking questions. If you have questions, please email the Forest Hills Connection. We will be posting this conversation, which is recorded online. It should be up tomorrow. And please you can include your questions in the comments there as well. So I want to thank you, both Marjorie and Professor Whelton, for engaging in this conversation and for taking all the time and effort you put into this and all the information you have given us. And I hope we can move DOEE into a more responsible stance in regulating the hot water CIPP that will be coming to Soapstone soon. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Whelton.
Thank you.